Today we're going to talk about Book 8 of Plato's Republic. Books 8 and 9 together offer a very rich and insightful discussion of politics, history, psychology, the relationship between all those things. And that's what we're going to focus on. Book 8 focuses in particular on the analysis of, I guess you could say, four kinds of regime. There are actually somewhat different ways you could count them, and I'll talk about that eventually. But they talk about what they call timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. At the end of Book 4, Socrates had effectively answered Glaucon's question to Glaucon's satisfaction, in that he had convinced Glaucon that the life of the just man is better than the life of the unjust man. So Glaucon was ready to end the conversation there, but Socrates said, no. I want to talk now. We've talked about, the best regime. Now I want to talk about the ones that aren't so good. He said, I think there are four types. And they were about to launch into that conversation, which is manifestly what Book 8 is, when Polemarchus and Adeimantus, at the beginning of Book 5, interrupted him and said, hey, you can't do that until you do something else first. Their interruption of him brought Socrates to talk about stuff he wasn't going to talk about. He was presumably going to go right to where he starts Book 8, once they were at the end of Book 4. And in that, at least two really important notions came out that it seems to me are very important for thinking about the things that are being talked about. That notion of humankind, or anthropos, and all the relevance associated with that, and the notion of the philosopher. At 544 D and E, they're talking about where these regimes are going to come from, and Socrates said, do you know that it's necessary that there also be as many forms of human characters as there are forms of regimes? Or do you suppose that the regimes arise from an oak or rocks, and not from the dispositions of the men in cities? I mean, the basic point to be noticed there is that even though way back in Book 2, Socrates said, cities are natural to us, right? Their human nature depends on the existence of cities for its realization. Even though they're natural, they don't arise by nature. They don't come from oaks or rocks. Like, they're not phenomena of the natural world in the way oak and rock are. Rather, they come from the dispositions of men in cities, right? People have to make them. And so what gets made comes from those people. And in as much as the city also just is the organization of those people, what those people are like is going to determine what the city is like. The second thing is the first part of that sentence. It's necessary that there also be as many forms of human characters as there are forms of regimes. Well, on the one hand, you could see that just as kind of a version of that same point I just made, that, cities are going to reflect who's in them and so on. But I think there's actually a little bit more to it than that. Right? Since, again, way back in Book 2, we've been operating with a certain kind of parallel of the city and the soul. Right? Socrates initially said, if we want to understand justice in the soul, shouldn't we look first at justice in the city and then compare it? Wouldn't that help us to see it? And he never really quite made clear what that comparison really meant until you finally get to Book 4 and they finally get to a point of analyzing justice in the city, and then they say, okay, that model will now allow us to understand justice in the soul. And the particular reason that is so is that he's arguing that your soul, what you are as a person, is inherently complex. There's more than one thing going on in you. There are things in you that pull in different directions, that have different needs, etc., etc. And so becoming a person, or having a character, is a way of organizing those things, a way of turning them, actually. It's a tropos, as Cephalus said. And so Socrates' point was that the issues in how you arrange and organize your soul, the dimensions of who you are, is analogous to the way cities have to be organized, and particularly in the sense that there are different sort of functions carried out by different aspects of you, and what you really want to have is the part of you that's best and suited to ruling, right? And so there we really saw that the organization of a character, the organization of a person or a personality, is helpfully understood on the model of a kind of political organization. That's like you're a kind of city inside you, right? And thinking in terms of the principles of the organization of political communities can be helpful for understanding the organization of your soul. Here, it seems to me in Book 8, that issue of the relationship between regime and soul comes up again, but in a somewhat different way. I guess actually two different ways. First, as we go through the different cities here, he's going to tell parallel stories of how a city has a certain kind of dynamism such that it gradually changes into something else. And he's going to say that there's a parallel and analogous story of how different types of people, different types of character come into being and bring about through their own dynamism the emergence of different kinds of character and so on. But also, in the account here, you see then they're not just parallel, there's also a causal interplay between them. The kind of regime you're living in is a significant part of shaping what kind of soul you have. And the kinds of souls there are is significant to realizing the regime and bringing about its development and change and so on. But now I want to say a second thing that's brought out here that I think is maybe even more powerful and important. And that is, as these different forms of city develop and transform into each other and whatever else happens, but as we look at the history of the changing forms of regime, it seems to me one of the things that's being shown is that the interpretation of what a person is changing. And so the history of the changing forms of the regime is kind of letting a new interpretation of the human being come on the scene. Through Book 5, and then again, I guess in Book 7, they were asking about what it would take for this regime that they'd been describing to come into being. And that's where Socrates said there are these three waves. And the discussion of the third wave, the philosopher, took us through Books 6 and 7. So that was telling you about what it takes for this regime to come into being. And now Socrates asks about, how it's going to pass out of being. I think that's a little bit odd because, part of the thing they were saying was that this was the city that's most going to be one, and they were talking about all the things that would happen so that the city could preserve itself. So it should actually be a little surprising that it's going to go away. But Glaucon treats that as unproblematic. And so he says, how's it going to happen? Well, it's worth getting the principle out of this. He says, Socrates asks, is it simply the case that change in every regime comes from that part of it which holds the ruling office when faction arises in it, while when it is of one mind it cannot be moved, be it composed of ever so few? I just want you to think about that idea. He presents it as a question, and that's more or less how he's going to analyze this. But I'd like you to think about that idea that it's the thing that rule is based on that is ultimately going to be what brings about the change. But anyway, then they say, how's this going to happen? Well, so he's going to have to describe something about how there are factions in the ruling class or something. And the thing he says is, okay, well, let's talk about it the way the Muses would talk about it. And then he says he's going to present it in a tragic mode of speech. One thing that I think is a little frustrating about Bloom's translation is that when Socrates starts imitating the Muses, that is to say, speaking as if it were the Muses speaking at 546a, Bloom does not mark that mimesis. He doesn't put in the quotation marks that really should be there for Socrates' long speech from 546a to 547a. So that's important to notice that. Anyway, the real conceptual content of what Socrates says there is at 546, the end of A and the beginning of B. He says, here's the problem. Here's why that city we thought we were going to make that was going to be able to preserve itself is actually going to fall apart. He says, although they are wise, the men you educated as leaders of the city will nonetheless fail to hit on the prosperous birth and barrenness of your kind with calculation aided by sensation, but it will pass them by. So remember in Book 5, when they got to the second wave talking about children, Socrates said, We're going to be like idle men and talk about this thing as if it were possible. We're not going to raise the question of whether it's possible or not. And what was that they were going to talk about? Whether you could breed human beings like you can breed guard dogs. Well, Socrates says here, turns out you can't do that. And anyway, he uses that to fit with his story about faction in the ruling class, because he says, well, you're supposed to be able to give birth to perfect guardians, but you're going to end up giving birth to people who aren't perfect guardians. That's where the faction is going to come from. That's not my concern. My concern is more the point he's making about the impossibility of controlling birth. But anyway, in the midst of talking about that, there is a very puzzling passage where Socrates talks about sort of the numbers that are involved. So he says divine birth has a perfect number and human birth has its sort of best number, and there's a certain relationship of those that we're aiming for and so on. You know, quite non-plausible. But the thing that's even more striking is that he describes these numerical relationships in terms that are quite hard to interpret. After Socrates has said this thing, he says that's what the Muses will say, and Glaucon says, and will say that what the Muses answer is right. So I think you have to notice that Glaucon's answer demonstrates complete lack of comprehension. You couldn't possibly have understood what Socrates just said. But he rolls with it. Anyway, I just want to remark on that because I think it's easy to get hung up on that by not really thinking when you're reading. And I think it's pretty obvious that that's intended to be, a lot of smoke. Anyway, the relevant point is we're going to talk about the regimes that actually exist. And then it gets very serious. Socrates begins by describing what he calls the timocracy, meaning basically the city of honor. And he says, this is the city that everybody in Greece thinks is great. We're talking about the city in Sparta or Crete. And so he is really going to describe basically the Spartan constitution and way of life, which I talked about before when we were looking especially at Book 3 and the beginning of Book 4, because I was saying that, Glaucon and Adeimantus seem very geared towards a kind of Spartan mentality, whereas Socrates, it seems to me, is doing something else. But so here again, he's going to describe that city, and I think this is the city that, people like Glaucon and Adeimantus admire, and it's not what Socrates admires. Anyway, he then goes on to describe how the guardians in this city live and how this city is organized. He says, they distributed land and houses to be held privately, while those who previously were guarded by them as free friends and supporters, they then enslaved and held as serfs and domestics, and they occupied themselves with war and with guarding against these men. He is describing the actual character of Sparta, where the Spartiates, as you'll remember, were the only citizens, the only people who could own land. They enslaved the other people there, the Helots, and they devoted themselves pretty exclusively to the practice of war, both for fighting elsewhere, but also for using their military force to hold down these people they'd enslaved. So as he says, they occupied themselves with war and with guarding against these men that they had enslaved. So he says at 547d, in honoring its rulers and in the abstention of its war-making apart from farming and the manual arts and the rest of money-making, in its provision for common meals and caring for gymnastic and the exercise of war, in all such ways won't it imitate the preceding regime, by which he means the one they described, this putative aristocracy. So the thing that I think is striking there is that notion of honoring its rulers. And related to that, precisely the marking out of a distinctive kind of guardian class. So the next part. But in being afraid to bring the wise to ruling office, and in leaning towards spirited and simpler men naturally more directed to war than to peace, in holding the wiles and stratagems of war in honor, and in spending all its time making war, won't those be the things that are most peculiar to this regime? In other words, aren't those the defining features of it? Yeah, this, like Sparta, is a city of war. Right? It's a city that's oriented towards winning victory. And it's a city built around people trying to establish social position by, being honored. But being honored also means, in the eyes of the city, doing honorable things. Right? So he said they honor their rulers, right? And they are going to fight to defend the city, which mostly means themselves and their own privilege. But so these are the Spartiates are people, rulers, who live by a code and who are committed to it. And that, I think, is the reason why it resembles the city of virtue that Socrates was defining, in the sense that it is commitment to something and the subordination of yourself and your private interests to the defense of something, right? And then he says, but also such men will desire money just as those in oligarchies do, and under cover of darkness pay fierce honor to gold and silver. So he's saying there, really these people are nonetheless committed to their own sort of private betterment and enrichment. And, though in a certain way these people look honorable, they're really ultimately going to be in pursuit of self-interest. That's it. That's his opening description. And the thing I'd want you to notice is that really sounds almost exactly the same as what Xenophon says about Sparta, right? So in his Constitution of the Spartans, I won't go through it in detail, but he says everyone knows the outstanding obedience of the Spartans to their rulers and laws, right? That's the same point. Like that's what the Spartans do. They're going to risk their lives to defend the situation of their city, the situation of their guardian class, and so on. Xenophon, like everybody else except Socrates, celebrates this as, a great city. But then Xenophon's point is this city has decayed. So he says, if someone were to ask me whether I felt the laws of Lycurgus, the lawgiver of Sparta, still remained unchanged, I could not confidently say yes. I know that in the past the Spartans preferred to stay in Sparta in moderate prosperity, rather than expose themselves to the flattery and corruption involved in governing other cities. In the past, they were afraid of being proved to have gold, but there are those now who even pride themselves in possessing some, etc., etc. So Xenophon is of the view that Sparta used to be a city of honor, defined basically the same way Socrates is defining it here, but that things have changed, and it has shown itself to be a city of self-interested people scrambling after wealth, right? And that's basically the same point that Socrates is going to go on to make. So after he gives that description, he then says, okay, we've talked about the regime, but now he says, let's talk about how a timocratic man comes into being. And the conversation changes here from a conversation with Glaucon to a conversation with Adeimantus. Right before the conversation with Adeimantus, Socrates had said, these people weren't educated by persuasion, but by force, the result of neglect of the true muse, accompanied by arguments and philosophy, while giving more distinguished honor to gymnastic than music. Again, that sounds very straightforwardly like the description of the educational system in Sparta that Xenophon describes in great detail. It's all about really nasty force being imposed on children growing up for years until they turn into hardened soldiers who want to win. And that really is education by gymnastic. Like they do a lot of training without music and philosophy. Like they don't have any art there. When he then talks to Adeimantus, they come up with a little family drama of how a timocratic character might emerge. And that's not quite the same claim. They don't take you into the Spartan educational system, but a similar result comes about. So he says, then in the conversation with Adeimantus describing the timocratic man, he says this person would be a lover of hearing, in the sense, I think, of wanting to hear himself praised, because love of honor is really what this city is about. So it says he's a lover of hearing, although he's by no means skilled in rhetoric. Again, I think that means two things. This is not a society that trains people in philosophy and critical thinking and that sort of thing. So he wouldn't be trained in rhetoric. But also it means he's easily taken in by praise. Like he just wants to receive praise, right? Uh, and it says this man will be brutal with slaves and so on. And he's a lover of ruling and of honor, not basing his claim to rule on speaking or anything of the sort, but on warlike deeds and everything connected with war. He is a lover of gymnastic and the hunt. So again, just a continuation of the description of the kind of person we mean by an honor-loving individual, the timocrat. But also quite a recognizable description of the Spartan, right? So he says again this point he made about gymnastic and music and being swayed by force rather than persuasion. He says what's lacking here in this person's soul is the best guardian. And Adeimantus says, what's that? And Socrates says, this is at 549b, argument mixed with music. Basically the same thing he'd said the page before. But I just want to note this line. He says, it alone, when it is present, dwells within the one possessing it as a savior of virtue throughout life. A very powerful claim he's making here that connects very much with the claims he made in Book 3 about musical education. In any case, that's the character. And so now with Adeimantus, he says, where does that come from? And so then he tells this little story. And he says, imagine this situation. Imagine you have a father who is actually virtuous. That man doesn't really want to participate in the games of the timocratic city to become someone powerful in the ruling offices and so on there, because he's committed to virtue. He's not an honor-loving person. So right off the bat, that should remind you of the story of the cave, and the man who comes back down and doesn't really want to play the games of the city. I mean, there are many places where we could see that structure, but that's one here, right? The virtuous man doesn't want to be part of the circus of the government of the timocratic city. But he says, what happens? Well, then he mentions this man's wife. One of the few mentions of women in here. He mentions this man's wife, who's like, "Well, you're not getting us any stuff. You're not winning us any honor in the city." And she doesn't like that because she feels her standing is lower in the eyes of her peers than it should be. And the son similarly hears this. And they also say, he's going to hear this even from the slaves and so on. People are just going to say, "Oh man, your dad, he's not very honorable. He's not doing his thing." Anyway, he says you can imagine a child growing up in a situation like that, not really understanding his father's, conscientious rejection of the public order. That child grows up, on the contrary, experiencing himself as growing up in a household that is treated as worth less than the households around him. Right, in the eyes of his peers and in the eyes of the society, he's coming from a worse house, and so to him, he grows up wanting to be honored. Right? And so he develops a certain character based on his experience of what his household was like, kind of in the eyes of the surrounding society. But he says, it's also not like he's just going to be a bad man. Right, he's growing up in a house where his father, is going to encourage him to think and all the rest. So he's a lot of him is being developed. It's just that the thing that he was suffering from was a lack of honor, and so that's what he wants. So he says, when the sun goes out, he hears those who mind their own business, which is how his father is being described. He hears them called simpletons and held in small account, whereas those who don't do that are the ones who are honored and praised. But when he hears and sees all that, but on the other hand, when he's at home, he hears his father's arguments and sees his practices at close hand, contrasted to those of the others, and they look pretty good. And so he's drawn by both of those influences. His father waters the calculating part of his soul and causes it to grow, the others the desiring and spirited parts. Because he doesn't have a bad man's nature, but has kept bad company with others, drawn by both of these influences, he comes to be in the middle, and he becomes a haughty-minded man who loves honor. So I just want to think for a moment about what this notion of an honor society really amounts to. Right, there really are social systems organized around the pursuit of honor. Or you can think of the samurai code of Bushido in Japan. Or in the Greek context, you can think of the world of the Homeric warriors. These are societies where people establish their standing by being well regarded by other powerful people. And they are well regarded because they perform, great warlike deeds that are all about risking themselves, that are all about saying it's not about me, it's about my defense of, and my throwing myself into defending that thing that needs to be defended. Right? That sort of, for lack of a better word, selflessness is why it's like virtue. Right? But, what is honor? Well, remember back in Book 4, we talked about the thumoides, the spirited part of the soul. And, what we really saw there was that spirit, which is the honor-loving part, is really about trying to establish sort of your place in relationship to the world. It's about, getting appropriately esteemed. Right? So remember then that this pursuit of honor, which is sort of apparently selfless in the sense that you're, saying that thing needs to be defended by me, is also about you receiving honor. It's about you winning the recognition for being, an honorable, a noble, a proper person. So, on the one hand, it looks selfless. On the other hand, it really is about establishing and securing your sense of yourself. And I think that's one of the things that's really brought out in that story of the timocratic youth, the child who grows up under the virtuous father. Like, that child is frustrated by the fact that his household is looked down upon. And the reason he wants honor is because he wants to be appropriately esteemed. Right? So I think that the story of the city and then the psychological story of the youth, it really draws attention to that double-sidedness of honor. That on the one hand, it's about devotion to a code. It's about you honoring something. But it's also about you being honored. And I think that ambivalence in honor, whether it's, selfless or self-interested, is really why then this city turns into the oligarchic city. Right? Because what this shows is that, of course societies can exist, with people going to their death to fight for things. That's very real. Right? This is a real kind of society. But implicit in that is that these people are deeply self-interested. It's not a city of virtue. It's a city of people, so to speak, getting rich on the relevant currency of that society, which is honor. And so I think what he's really getting at is that implicitly, what's really always going on is that these are individuals trying to do well by themselves. And so, what you discover is that honor itself can basically be bought and sold. And so what happens is that self-interest gradually redefines the meaning of honor, right? That in the course of its history, the Society of Honor demonstrates that shift of honor as meaning what is honored to meaning what is being honored. It demonstrates the shift from honor as being a way that you serve that thing to honor being a way that you are served. And so, what actually happens is people learn they can become honored even without being truly honorable, according to the norms of that society. So people spend a lot of money to make themselves look like great benefactors, or they partake in the Olympic Games and show themselves to be, great athletes and so on. They win a lot of public praise. There are a lot of things people can do to be praised as really great people, even though none of those things that are winning them praise are evidence of them serving an honorable purpose. And I think that is the reality of what happened in this culture. So really, the person who's seeking honor is seeking power in that society, is seeking the improvement of their own position in that society. And so he says, that's not really very far from money loving. So I just want to talk about this issue of the honor society a bit more, and this idea of its transformation into oligarchy or society of money, to try to make it a little bit more intuitively immediate. Right? And so, maybe when you were a teenager or something, you thought those samurai were amazing, or the Homeric heroes or whatever, or you sort of admire those militaristic honor societies. It's good if you can find in yourself that kind of memory, if you ever had it. But maybe you don't, that's fine. But let's think of a situation, a familiar situation where I think you can see how people are like that and what happens. So I was imagining some kind of street gang. You can imagine people who fight, and they develop a gang of fighters. And from the point of view of a community, those people might say, oh, those guys are terrorizing our community. Because what's happening is those people are making themselves rulers. They're using their proficiency at fighting and their willingness to fight to, take over a community, to extract wealth from it, to boss people around or whatever. The way you get into the gang is you got to be prepared to fight and risk your life. You got to be prepared to die. And you got to go get in and become really loyal to that gang. Right? That's an honor society. Right? That's a society where people develop a sense of themselves as the worthwhile ones. They take money from the other people in the community because they disrespect them. They think they're weak. Yeah, we can take it. And their claim to superiority and strength is the fact that they are willing to risk their lives to die. So they think they deserve honor. They deserve, they say, I want respect. And they might even say, that's what I get from people. I get respect. Right? They've made honor their code. Like they're not calculating what they can do to stay alive. They're throwing everything in to the contest. And by virtue of the fact that they do that, they get to rise to the top and say, we're the ones, right? We're the best. There, I think you can see the coming together of that notion of honor, sort of militarism, guardianship, in the sense of saying we're the ones in charge of those other people we don't respect very much. But sometimes people do in a way act as guardians. I mean, that's kind of the idea of even a protection racket. Like you say, yeah, you're going to pay me this stuff, but we're going to protect you. And you might even think against other rival gangs, this is our community. And, partially you're protecting yourself, but you're also saying you stay out of our community. An offense against them is an offense against us. Right? So I just want you to see how much the familiar workings of a street gang fit this, the story of the guardians, and therefore fit the story of the timocracy. But now, again, I think you can be. I imagine you're very familiar with the idea that thing can kind of be corrupted by money, right? Because what happens? You can think of a few different stories. Somebody from the outside looks on at those guys and sees they're getting pretty rich and powerful, by stealing from the community. Or maybe the community pays them tribute out of fear, or maybe even it is out of a kind of respect, because people don't even realize they've been terrorized by them. They think, oh, our life is just normally so bad, and you guys are actually taking care of us against those other people who are going to exploit us and whatever. Who knows? But for whatever reason, that gang can get quite rich. And so somebody looking on from the outside can admire them, but might be admiring them because of their riches. And so a person might say, I want that. Right? And so you can imagine, first of all, someone who, from the outside, looks on and doesn't primarily see that as a society of honor. It sees it as an exploitative society of money making, which in a significant way it is. Even if those people are telling themselves that it's about honor, as I was saying before, like there's a deeply self-interested character to that group that involves them getting rich and powerful, extracting all the resources from their community and so on. And so somebody looking on from the outside might, in a way, see through them to what's implicit. But you can also imagine that happening to someone on the inside. Somebody might be doing this and getting rich, and at a certain point they think, well, I really like my rich lifestyle, and maybe I don't want to go out and die anymore. Maybe I want to do the things that allow me to enjoy this luxurious, rich life I've developed without going out and maybe getting stabbed in the neck or something like that, or shot in the head, right? So it seems to me that from an outsider's perspective, or even from an insider's perspective, you can see how easy, almost natural it would be for someone to become a kind of money lover. Or at least, even if any given person isn't going to do that, you can see how that's going to happen, right? But from within that society, you can see that's also a kind of a betrayal of it. And you really see that, think of familiar movies, right? You really see that when it turns out, one of the guys in the gang who you thought was your honor buddy, is actually an FBI informant or something, and has been selling out the group or whatever for whatever. I mean, protection, but probably money and a bunch of other things, right? You can imagine somebody who's been making deals with the other gang, right? And so you thought this person was in the fight with you, but really that person was already involved in a different game. They had found a different way to maintain the veneer of honorability while secretly, feathering their own nest by other means, right? And when that's found out, people recognize that as a profound betrayal. And it's for that reason that it has to be done in secret by those people, right? They can't really admit it. And they might even feel a bit guilty about it. They might be conflicted themselves if they were, street fighters who now sold out their friends and sold out in the sense of turned that into money making, right? But so if you think about that example, then I think you can see that fits quite nicely with what Socrates says, and in a certain sense with the reality of Sparta. So Socrates says, the treasure house full of gold, which each man has, destroys the regime. First, they seek out expenditures for themselves and pervert the laws in that direction. Next, I suppose, one man sees the other and enters into a rivalry with him. And from there, they progress in money-making, and the more honorable they consider it, the less honorable they consider virtue. Instead of men who love victory and honor, they finally become lovers of money-making and money, and they praise and admire the wealthy man and bring him to the ruling offices while they dishonor the poor man. Some version of that is more or less what Xenophon is complaining about as actually happening in Sparta. And I think, part of, again, the claim here is that is the reality of these cities, that they have become cities ruled by the rich. I do want to talk about one specific thing, though, in Greek history that I think is relevant. And so, it is a reality that in the Greek cities, various contexts, there was a property assessment, and the eligibility to participate in public office depended on the level of your property. Now, I want to just make one point about that. From the point of view of what we might more familiarly call democracy, that notion of a wealth qualification can look like grounds for excluding people. And that's, more or less the way it's taken up here. The poor are excluded. And that's surely correct. But also historically, it's kind of significant for a different reason. And that is that by establishing wealth, levels of wealth, as the criterion for participation in public office, what's actually being opposed is the idea that public office all goes to the hereditary aristocracy, the hereditary nobility. Right? We use these words, aristocracy and nobility, which makes it sound like those people are good. Those are the words those people like to give to themselves. But that really becomes their argument for why they should rule. We're the good ones. We should rule with our handed down status. And establishing wealth as a criterion for public office challenges that and says it's not about your birth. It's not about your reputation as being, really good. It's not that gets you into office. It's actually anyone who has a certain level of wealth is eligible to participate. So historically, in Greece, that shift to the property assessment can actually be seen as a kind of progressive move, challenging the hereditary aristocracy. Nonetheless, it sets certain property limits and excludes people who don't have that much, and that's why then, looked at from the point of view of the democracy, it can seem exclusionary. In any case, the reality in the Greek cities was that, as Socrates goes on to say here, and as Aristotle says in his account of Greek history, there was virtually civil war between rich and poor in these cities. I don't want to go on and talk in any particular detail about the history, and also there's tons of really interesting stuff in this analysis here, just for the account of politics and the account of oligarchy that is, I think, is really rich and worth pursuing. But I'm not going to go through that. I really want to just emphasize a couple of particular points that I think are striking. The first thing I want to note is just that quotation I read, where he says, the treasure house full of gold which each man has destroys the regime. I want you to think about that idea about the sort of private storing of wealth, right? And especially the idea here that there's a kind of secrecy about that. Right? I want you to notice how really different that attitude is for a person compared to the attitude of the warrior we were talking about. Like the warrior is, throws himself out into things, right? And he's like, I'll take on anything. And he throws himself out without reserve, right? This is precisely about reserve. It's about saying, yeah, I'm going to have a public image, but I'm going to guard who I really am. I'm going to hold it back. And that's what's happening personally with your attitude. It's what's happening with money too, right? Money is taking, value as such, that, and then holding onto it and storing it, right? If you think of your own bank account, you did a bunch of work, let's say, and you got paid. You got paid in whatever it is, dollars or francs or rupees or something, right? Those rupees are just, units of exchangeable value. And so you did the work to get that, but then you said, okay, I'm not going to spend it now. I'm just going to put it away. And so you held on to the value you had accumulated, maybe for using it later. But notice then that just as this is sort of personally an attitude of reserve, it's also a relationship towards wealth that is holding it in reserve. And that's basically what money is. It's the opposite of that unreserved throwing of himself into action of the, fighter and so on. And so, it's important to know that a money economy developed in ancient Greece in contrast to basically what you might call an honor economy or a gift economy in the time of the Greek city-states. And it's basically in ancient Greece that coined money was invented. And so the rise in fact of, money-loving regimes is correlated with the sort of invention of that possibility, right? The inauguration of a money economy. So it's not just like people choosing, one of the options that was hanging around already. The story Socrates is talking about here, the reality of it, is that this regime is carving out the new way of approaching the world, that is money. And so, I said before that it seems to me Socrates' story of the history here is the story of, really changing ways that we experience ourselves as human beings, moving from honor now to money. I'm saying that there's one of the real changes there, this revolution in economics that goes along with this sort of change in attitude. Well, I think something similar is going to happen when we turn to democracy in a little while. But anyway, with that in mind, I want to now look a little bit at the story of the oligarchic man, the emergence of that kind of psychological attitude. And basically he says, imagine this. Again, he tells stories of fathers and sons, right? Telling about, what happens in the household. Right? And so he says, imagine the father is a timocrat, an honorable man. And you can think back to my sort of street fighting story or something like that. Father's an honorable man. And what happens is other people who are not honorable crush him. Like, he gets taken to the courts or whatever, and he loses all of his wealth, loses whatever he has. So basically, he thought he was operating in a system of honor, but it turns out he's not, and he's exploited by people who don't care about that. And I think you might think of the hero Ajax in this context, who really thought he deserved to win the arms of Achilles after Achilles' death. But Odysseus got it. And Odysseus is, maybe a kind of a clever manipulator. And, Ajax really felt like I should be recognized by the rules of honor, and I was failed by this system. And so, and again, as I said before about the timocratic father, you have this situation of a person who's standing up for a certain ideal and therefore not playing by the rules of the game that the other people are actually playing by. And that again should remind you of that issue of, what happens when you come back down into the cave from the light and you don't want to play in the terms of that game. Very similar set of issues are raised. Anyway, but he says, so the son grows up with this, father who was trying to be honorable, and because the father was trying to be honorable, he lost everything. And so he says, the father blunders against the city as against a reef. The city is supposed to be the thing that protects you, and instead it took advantage of it, right? And so the son, seeing and suffering this and having lost his substance, is frightened. And so he thrusts love of honor and spiritedness out of the throne of his soul, and humbled by poverty, he turns greedily to money-making. And bit by bit, saving and working, he collects money. Right? So he says, picture yourself in that situation where because of your father's stand on honor, you lost everything, and now you have to scramble seemingly just to exist. Right? So he says, here you can imagine that as the emergence of a kind of oligarchic man, because this guy now wants money and loves it in the sense that he thinks that's what I need. That's what is really going to make it possible for me to succeed and be successful. Right? The thing that is particularly interesting about this is he says, think about the attitude of that person. He says, that's a person who, and you can go back to remembering him talking with Cephalus about, whether you inherited your money or earned it. This is a guy who has got to make his own way and make his own money. And so he gets rich, but he doesn't get rich so that he can squander his money on things. He gets rich kind of out of fear and is very interested in protecting himself. And so he just wants to hold on to money. And so he says this guy is stingy. So he doesn't spend because he's afraid of that situation of, losing his substance. He doesn't spend. He just wants to acquire. So he says this guy then is also going to be very careful about distinguishing, what does he really need to spend money on and what doesn't he? And so he says at 554a, in being stingy and a toiler, satisfying only his necessary desires and not providing for other expenditures, but enslaving the other desires as vanities. Right? That's the description of the attitude of the oligarchic man. What I want you to notice there, that I think is really important for understanding the book, is it's the oligarchic man who makes the distinction between the necessary desires and the unnecessary desires. Right? That's not a neutral or obviously correct description of our desires. It's how desires look to a stingy guy who's frightened about preserving his wealth. What does he take to be the necessary desires? Well, I guess the ones that just keep him alive, because he thinks, I'm not going to waste my money on those other things. Right? Very different from the attitude of the timocratic man, who's not trying to keep himself alive. But to the extent that that timocrat really lived by the sort of martial standards of that society of honor, he's prepared to throw himself into the situation and die. Right? And it's only someone who's prepared to do that that's worth anything, that's honorable. So what the oligarch considers necessary, the timocrat doesn't see as necessary. Indeed, to be honorable, you have to be prepared to die, whereas that's what the oligarch is not prepared to do. So I want you to see already that sense of what is necessary is reflective of values. And I made this point before when talking about Socrates' discussion of the emergence of the city in Book 2. He said, it comes out of human need. But then the only needs he talks about are sort of what we might call our animal needs, right? The needs to keep us alive. But Socrates has made the point before in the Apology. Well, I guess after, since that's when he's going to die. But Socrates makes the point that what matters is not whether you live or die, but what you're prepared to die for, what you take a stand on. So I was saying that the discussion of desires back in Book 2 is something we need to be pretty critical about. And I especially tried to bring in that notion of erotic necessity that Glaucon introduced in Book 5. Well, anyway, here, it's in the oligarchic attitude, you see the emergence of the distinction that they basically did rely on back there. So, I'm talking about necessary and unnecessary desires, and I said before, when that issue came up with Glaucon talking about erotic necessities and so on, and then again when we talked about the erotic man at the end of Book 5, I said that I thought we were going to need to go back and reinvestigate the way desire was discussed in Book 4, right? This notion of epithumia. So I also showed you how at the end of Book 5, the language of epithumia and the language of eros and the language of philia were sort of being equated. And I was saying, when you see the relationship between eros and philosophy, the development of our highest part, it doesn't look like the way we thought epithumia stood in relationship to the calculating part back in the first discussion of Book 4. Well, there's more going on here relevant to that story of the reevaluation of desire. I want to just draw your attention to the way that theme of love, philia in particular, has been coming up throughout these pages, right? When he talks about, back in the Honor Society, when he talks about the people there, he says they're honor-loving. So at 548c, he talks about them as having love of victories, philonikiae, and love of honors, philotimiae. So that's the same structure, philo something or other, just like he talked about the wine lover or the boy lover or philosophia, right? He's using the same language here that he made a point of emphasizing at the end of Book 5. The thing that's interesting is he's here talking about these guys who love honor and love victories and so on. That's what he otherwise describes as the attitude of the spirited part. But that attitude of the spirited part, he's now calling the philotimiae or philonikiae, right? So the same thing, it seems, can be described either as an attitude of the desiring part or the spirited part. And that comes up more. In case you didn't think those conversations were related, it's really worth noticing that at the end of 540 and the beginning of 549a, he refers to that guy in the Honor Society as somebody who loves music, philomuson, but also a lover of hearing, phileikon. which is exactly the word they used at the end of Book 5 when when Glaucon talked about the lover of sights and the lover of hearing at 475d. And then he even goes on here at 549a just to keep underlining this. They're also the lover of gymnastic, philogymnastes, and lover of the hunt, philotheros. So the language of philia is just, this text is just saturated with it. And so then when he distinguishes the honor guy from the money guy, the distinction is between lover of victory and lover of money. There's the, at 551a, philocrematistai and philocrematoi, lover of money making and lover of money. So my point then is that we're seeing a richer engagement with just what goes on at the level of desire. And the relationship between the desire and the spirited part, for example, now looks a little different than we thought. Just as with philosophia, the relationship between desire and the highest part, the calculating part or the intellectual part, looks a little different than we had initially thought. I want to draw your attention to one other passage in here, and this is at 553d. When he says these money lovers are going to make the desire for money making rule everything, and so they're going to subordinate calculation and the spirited part. So he says, he makes the calculating and spirited parts sit by it on the ground on either side and be slaves, letting the one neither calculate about nor consider anything but where more money will come from less, and letting the other, the spirited part, admire and honor nothing but wealth and the wealthy. I just want to draw your attention to that, right? You've just been told pretty exactly what that spirited part does. It admires and honors. So I think you have to ask yourself here how to construe the relationship between admiring and honoring, what the relationship is between that and loving, desiring. So I want to draw your attention to that. And now I just want to go on now to the last thing about oligarchy, to talk about what are the specific problems that come out of that and how Socrates analyzes those, and then we'll go on to democracy. So, continuing his conversation with Adeimantus, Socrates identifies a number of problems with the oligarchical regime. He says at 551b, what are the mistakes which we say it contains? Well, we're able to make sense of the mistakes because we have thought about what it is to be a polis, right? We have thought about that concept and thought about what it's supposed to be. And so we can look at an actual one and see what's wrong with it. And so he says, first, the very thing that defines the regime is a mistake. Reflect. If a man were to choose pilots of ships in that way, on the basis of property assessments, and wouldn't entrust one to a poor man, even if he were a more skilled pilot, Adeimantus chimes in, that would make a poor sailing. So, the basic point he makes here is a version of the one he made way back in Book 1 when he was first talking with Thrasymachus about techne and money-making. And the point is, it's a different thing to carry out a craft well and to try to make money. They might come together, but they're different things. And so he's saying here, one of the essential dimensions of the city is that somebody needs to rule it. And, competent rulers are rulers who are oriented towards justice and understand what the city is, and consequently make wise decisions about policy and so on, for the sake of benefiting the city as a whole, right? As opposed to benefiting a single class or anything like that, as he said to Adeimantus at the beginning of Book 4. But the oligarchy doesn't put the wise in the position of rule. It puts the moneymakers in the position of rule. And that's a very different thing. That's not unique to the oligarchy. A similar thing was the case already in the timocracy. He said there, at 547e, when he's talking about what's wrong with it, he said, they're afraid to bring the wise to the ruling offices. They lean towards spirited and simpler men, men naturally more directed to war than to peace. Right? So, already the timocracy was, not putting the right people in charge. They were putting people in charge who could win a war. So that's a little different than this, but it's a similar problem. But yeah, maybe money making is even a little bit worse, because at least the rulers of the timocracy were not just working for themselves, right? They were trying to win a war, for the city, or at least for their class. The moneymakers are out for their own good. Right? So you can see there that it seems to be an even greater deterioration of the quality of the ruling office. But then he continues. He says, he then identifies another mistake, and he said, such a city is not one, but of necessity two, the city of the poor and the city of the rich, dwelling together in the same place, ever plotting against each other. Again, he's saying a second problem here is that it's not really one, because it's really the rulers against the poor who they're exploiting. Well, once again, that was pretty much already the case in the timocracy, since remember, as he said, that what they did is they enslaved those people who should be their free friends and supporters and occupied themselves with war and guarding against these men. So again, the oligarchy and the timocracy, in a pretty important way, are basically the same regime in that the oligarchy is really, it seems to me, just making explicit, really explicit, the problems that were already there. But then he goes on. He says, and further, this isn't a fine thing, eh? They're being perhaps unable to fight any war because they'd be compelled to use the multitude armed and be more afraid of it than the enemy. Or not be able to fight themselves. If they had to fight themselves, they were no longer trained for war. It just emphasizes this idea, right, that there's a fundamental antagonism between the rulers and the ruled, which contradicts the very idea of what a city is supposed to be, contradicts the very idea of what the rulers are supposed to be. But that's where this whole thing started, with the timocracy. But I want to move on to the next one, because he says, now see whether this regime is the first to admit the greatest of all these evils. And he says, what is that? He says, allowing one man to sell everything that belongs to him and another to get hold of it, and when he has sold it, allowing him to live in the city while belonging to none of its parts. So, in the money-making city, you're a target. You're someone can make money from. And, that's how people treat you. And the result of that is you can be taken for all you're worth in the dollars and cents of that. And you can be stripped of all your means and left destitute. And the thing that he emphasizes about that is that it leaves you without function. You remember, way back again from Book 2, right? The whole way we were construing justice was everyone doing their function. So it's an unjust situation when someone isn't doing their function. But in this case, it seems to me, that's an injustice done to someone. Someone is stripped of the possibility of functioning, of contributing to the city. And then he says about the rich person, so he says, imagine that was a rich person who lost all his money. Okay, but whatever. Think about what that rich person or some rich person is like. He said, when such a man was wealthy and was spending, was he then of any more profit to the city with respect to the functions we were mentioning just now? Or did he seem to belong to the rulers, while in truth he was neither a ruler nor a servant of the city, but a spender of his means? Right, so somebody gets stripped of their money and they're left not being able to contribute functionally to the city. But the fact is, these rich people are like that already. They're not contributing to the function of the city. They're just taking money and they're spending it. And their acquisition of wealth and their expenditure of wealth has nothing to do with the health and well-being of the city. It's only their, private interests that are at play there. So the real profound injustice here comes from the rich extracting the wealth from the society and using it for purposes that have nothing to do with the health of the society. And by so doing, stripping other people of the possibility of contributing healthily to the functioning of the city. And in that case, whether it's the now poor person or the rich person, he describes them as drones, using the image of the bees. And he says these are the people who, eat the honey but don't contribute anything. Right? And so that notion of the drone is kind of like a parasite on the healthy functioning of the city is now a reality. And that kind of dominates in the city now. So the next regime they consider is democracy, which can arise out of oligarchy. And so they say, how does this transformation happen? And he says, well, it happens as a result of the insatiable character of the good that oligarchy proposes for itself, the necessity of becoming as rich as possible. Right? So the insatiable character of the good, there's something about that particular goal, money making, that doesn't have a limit. And he says, because of that, as we already saw, they're unwilling to control those among the youth who become licentious and squander their money by a law forbidding them to spend and waste what belongs to them. Because what they want is, when they buy and make loans on property and so on, the people who loan money and so on can get richer and richer and richer, right? So if getting richer is the goal, they're going to encourage people to lose everything they have. And so, it's a city that ends up just making more and more people poor. And so he says that ultimately produces, two cities, a city of the poor opposed to the city of the rich. And so they're in conflict. And he says at 557a, then democracy, I suppose, comes into being when the poor win, killing some of the others and casting out some, and they share the regime and the ruling offices with those who are left on an equal basis. And for the most part, the offices in it are given by lot. Right? So that's basically the definition of a new kind of regime, a new way of determining who's in the guardian class and how it's going to work. And then he goes on to talk about the distinctive character of the democratic regime. He says, so about these people, in the first place, then, aren't they free? And isn't it a city full of freedom and free speech, eleutheria and parrhesia? And isn't there license in it, exousia, to do whatever one wants? So the democracy is a city of freedom. Indeed, he'll say that later at 562b. Democracy defines the good as freedom. And in the city of freedom, where there is license, it's up to you to do your own thing, he says, it's plain that each man would organize his life in it privately just as it pleases him. And then in this regime especially, all sorts of human beings come to be. So, I was saying that it seems to me in this changing character of the city, we're actually witnessing a change in how we understand ourselves as human beings. And it seems to me we're getting more of that here. Right? What you're really getting out of democracy is the conception of the person in the strongest sense as an individual. Right? It's someone who's free on his or her or their own to choose and shape their own life. Right? And that, it seems to me, corresponds to what we were noticing in Book 5 when we were talking about the distinctive thing that lets you be a responsible citizen. So the issues that I was raising in Book 5, I think, start to meet up pretty interestingly with the discussion of democracy here. And also, in Books 6 and 7, we were focusing on the philosopher. And I want to remind you again of a couple of things that were said there. Back in Book 6, when Socrates was talking about the way sophists can manipulate the emotions of the great beast of public opinion, he was talking about what kind of views a multitude can have. Basically a multitude as opposed to an individual. He said at 493e, can a multitude accept or believe that the fair itself, rather than the many fair things, or that anything itself is rather than the many particular things? Adeimantus says no. But the point is there's a kind of recognition, particularly that katharao, that seeing through, right, where you, from your experience, recognize something in it you weren't recognizing before, right? But you have to recognize it. So the 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 thing we've been looking at when we've been talking about the capacity to recognize what's going on in nous, right? When we've been talking about that whole higher dimension of our experience, is something that is inherently individual. You have to do it yourself. You have to make the recognition, right? And then that's, of course, what they were talking about in Book 7 when they were talking about turning, right? So at the end of the story of the cave, they're saying, we got to turn the soul. And so that's what they were then going to look at, those studies that turn the soul. And I just want you to think about that idea, right? Turning the soul. That's an individual has to change his or her, their perception, right? And that's also then why he said at 533a, you will no longer be able to follow, my dear Glaucon. You have to do it yourself. Right? So my point is, in Book 6 and 7, when we were looking at the philosopher, we were also looking at forms of experience, and extremely important forms of experience, that are uniquely available to individuals. So again, just as the story of citizenship, or what it means to be a citizen, starts to dovetail with the story of democracy, which produces the conception of the person as an individual, so does the story of philosophy dovetail with that. And again, just let me go back. Remember I said before that books 2 through 4 really seem to focus, there's lots of things in there, but they really seem to focus on essentially the spirited person, because they're talking so much about the guardian and war and so on. So it's really the person as defined by spirit that they're really after. Whereas books 5, 6, and 7, it seems to me, are really talking about the person as defined by nous and so on. And I think what we can see if we connect up the story of democracy with that is that the whole essential study of the person contained in that set of 3 books is a person essentially defined as individual. Anyway, let's get back to democracy and the general description of it. So, the democratic regime as described here, and its descent into tyranny, is more or less the portrait of Athens, in the way that timocracy and oligarchy were more or less the portrait of Sparta. And there, Socrates' analysis of the transformation of timocracy into oligarchy mirrors more or less Xenophon's description of the decay of Sparta. And here, he's now going to turn to the issue of Athens, which was a democracy, and the kind of threat in that, the very realistic kind of threat in that city, that it's going to be taken over by a tyrant. So, on the one hand, there are 4 regimes named here: timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. But in a way, it looks like, we're mostly looking at kind of 2 things. The 2 forms that, can happen in a place like Sparta, and then the 2 things that can happen in the democracy, more or less. And I'm going to come back again later to a different issue about how to sort of count these regimes. In any case, in describing the democracy, Socrates, as I said before, identified these 2 special things, eleutheria and exousia. They both could be translated in English by the word freedom. And so the fact that there are 2 different Greek words there, I think, is helpful for getting us to notice an ambiguity in our use of the word freedom. Sometimes when we use the word freedom, we say, you can do whatever you want. And the idea there is nobody's going to inhibit you. It's just up to you to decide. That's a very important sense of freedom, and we're going to talk about it a bit more. But there's another sense of freedom too, and that is sometimes we use freedom to mean more like having the ability, right? You can do whatever you want. And that's a little bit different, right? If you want to, play music or something, to be free to play great music, you first have to study it. Right? And so when we think of freedom as the ability to do something, that freedom actually presupposes discipline, right? Like, if I think of my son, my 5-year-old son, like he speaks quite well now, and he's pretty free to express himself. But if I had said to him when he was 1 year old, you're free to say whatever you want, right? He precisely wasn't free to say whatever he wants. He had no capacity to express himself. And in fact, I think he found that quite frustrating, which is why he was propelled from within himself to learn language. Right? But to be free to express himself, he had to learn language. And he had to learn how it works. He can't just make it up arbitrarily. He had to learn the rules. So he had to apprentice himself to a norm-governed reality that dictates to him what he has to do. Right? So freedom, in the sense of eleutheria, is premised on discipline. It's premised on answerability. It means you've accepted guidance and taken instruction, which is quite the opposite of freedom understood as, yeah, do whatever you want, right? You actually have to basically renounce freedom as exousia in order to have freedom as eleutheria. Socrates and Adeimantus then go on to discuss democracy, and as with oligarchy and timocracy, their orientation is mostly towards what problems it has, how it's got built into it, something that makes it not automatically the best thing. And the criticisms they develop largely revolve around this issue of exousia. What they want to show is that precisely because democracy empowers you to think and do as you like, and it puts every individual sort of equally in the position to participate in the governing offices, it means the city is now governed by the opinions of whoever, by whatever opinion you happen to have, that can now govern things. That criticism, as I expressed it there, is a familiar one. It's very much the criticism of Athens that was made by oligarchic sympathizers, and that's pretty much the perspective that we've been grappling with throughout this whole book. Because, as I said, I think that is pretty much the perspective that Glaucon and Adeimantus come with. And so that critique of Athens as a city of license where nobody has any discipline, and consequently decision-making is in the hands of anybody's arbitrary opinion and so on, that's pretty much the view expressed by this unknown person that they call the old oligarch, who wrote a document called the Polity of the Constitution of the Athenians. And it seems to me that kind of critique of the sort of corruption of the city by democracy is what they pretty much give voice to here. Some of the more specific issues they talk about, I'm going to come back to next time when we talk about Book 9 and tyranny. But so I just want to bring out what I think is more the thrust of the overall thing. So again, we're talking about the historical reality of democracies, and a real concern people had is that precisely because decision-making is in the hands of anybody, and anybody's opinion can shape civic decisions, people who are good at manipulating opinion are the ones that the democracy especially empowers to seize power. And so, a real concern and a reality was that, charismatic, sweet-talking individuals with deeply self-interested goals could present themselves as friends of the people, could claim about themselves that they were great supporters of democracy and the empowerment of the people, and convince people to support them, when in fact those individuals were not supporters of the people. They were people who wanted to seize power and become tyrants, become autocratic rulers of the cities. And so the democracy is in that way particularly prone to being overtaken by deceivers, populists, people who can pretend to be for the people but are really self-interested. So he says at 565c, aren't the people always accustomed to set up some one man as their special leader and to foster him and make him grow great? It's plain, therefore, that when a tyrant grows naturally, he sprouts from the root of leadership and from nowhere else. And then at 565e, he refers to this leader of the people who, taking over a particularly obedient mob, doesn't hold back from shedding the blood of his tribe, but unjustly brings charges against a man, brings him before a court, murders him, etc., etc. He hints at the cancellation of debts and the redistribution of land, and then he incites people against those who have wealth, and then he makes the tyrannical request to ask the people for some bodyguards, and then, having cast down many others, he stands in the chariot of the city, now a perfected tyrant instead of a leader. So, that's basically the story of someone who says, yeah, we're going to redistribute wealth, we're going to redistribute land, we're going to cancel debts. And so people say, yeah, this is our man, let's have him as our leader. What he really wants to do is use the power of all those people to steal more money from whoever's rich and whatever else. And when he is put in that power, he's not a nice guy. He unjustly charges people with things, he murders people, and then he eventually basically just takes over the city, and instead of being a leader, he's become a tyrant. As he said at 546a, at the beginning of Book 8, for everything that has come into being, there is decay. So back in Book 5, he'd said, every beautiful thing is also an ugly thing. Every just thing is also unjust, right? We have been emphasizing this theme of the sort of inherent ambivalence of things, and the idea that if you see them in light of what they're trying to be, you need to be able to see how they sort of are and are not that thing. Well, so similarly here, in a very dynamic way, that idea that the beautiful thing is also ugly is connected with the idea here that everything is going to decay. And so what Socrates has done with each of these regimes that holds itself up as good in a certain way, whether with respect to honor or money-making or freedom, he wants to show how in each case that thing has built into it another side, such that it turns out to be the opposite of what it claimed it was going to be. He doesn't particularly emphasize how these things could be good, but he really tries to show you how they break down. So I want to make one more point about that issue of how a thing can be good and how a thing can be bad. I said that there's some issue about how to count these regimes. Well, let me tell you why I said that. When he analyzes timocracy and oligarchy, it really seems like the same regime going from one face to its other face. And he talks about how the democracy turns into a tyranny, but surely that's a different regime, right? Tyranny is not the same regime as democracy. So oligarchy turned into a civil war. And when the oligarchs lost, a new city came into being defined by a new principle. So it was like the story of timocracy and oligarchy, like the story of Sparta, came to an end and a kind of a new story began. But when the tyrant came into being, it seemed like that story of democracy ended too. But now, interestingly, you notice he compared the tyrant to a leader. Right? And the point was, he's not a leader. He springs from the root of leadership, but he's not a leader properly speaking, as back in Book 5 we saw the philosopher king, so-called, would be, right? The real leader should be the embodiment of wisdom. This tyrant is the opposite. So it's a single person running things, but for the opposite of the reasons of leading. He's just trying to take advantage. So timocracy and oligarchy seemed like one regime, basically when a small group of people run things. You saw two faces of it. The tyrant is contrasted with the true leader. So again, we have this idea that you could have one person running things, and that could be good or bad. If you go back to democracy for a moment, we never really got to see two faces of it. We only saw it in decay, and then saw how a new thing came into being, the tyranny. And I think it's really worth thinking about that opening remark when he said that democracy is characterized by eleutheria and exousia. It seems to me that the portrayal of the decay of democracy, why it doesn't work, is all built around emphasizing the way in which democracy empowers exousia. So we saw democracy as a regime of exousia and how that goes wrong. But what he never studied with us or for us was democracy as the regime of eleutheria. And so it seems to me that's left for us as a kind of question. Back in Book 3, he said, good training in music means you develop a sense for what's missing, what's been left out. And it seems to me what was left out in this story was the account of what the regime of Eleutheria would be.